Also asked Portland police about domestic violence calls. Now, they didn't have any stats for us right now, but you may have seen some of these headlines we're putting on the screen saying that for people who live with an abuser, staying home is not always safe. And now that people are under an order to stay home, those people might not feel like they have anywhere to go. One of the stories that we want to highlight here is from the New York Times. It says an uptick in domestic violence has already been recorded in China. The hashtag anti-domestic violence during epidemic has also been trending on Chinese social media since the outbreak started. So is something like that also happening here at home? Well, we reached out to Raphael House, a domestic violence shelter in Portland. They told us our 24-hour hotline has been receiving more calls than usual, and we anticipate that will only continue to increase as domestic violence abusers take advantage of this crisis by using power, violence, and threats to control their partners. They're also seeing more survivors who are reaching out in need of things like food, since a lot of people have lost their jobs. So, what can victims do during this time? Well, experts say people living with an abuser should find the safest part of their home. Also, shelters are allowed to stay open right now, but some have decided to close to stop the spread of this virus. In that case, victims can still call for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. And in an emergency, you should always call 911. If you don't feel safe calling for help, the experts recommend that you ask a friend or a family member whom you trust.